We have an upcoming Power Hour in December with EcoCycle. We're really pleased to be hearing about the role of zero waste as a climate solution. And then also there's a need for public testimony at the PUC. The date is Thursday, December 2nd. If you would sign up ASAP and then make a plan to attend a November training. There'll be 3 dates. The training will be the same at each of those, or more or less the same. They will not be recorded. Information is on the EOF website. All right, I see that it's 6:03, so I think, and we've got quite a number of folks here, so let's go ahead. Let me get started by introducing our speaker this evening, John Farrell. We're just delighted to have you. Thanks for getting here, all the way from Minnesota. John is the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and he directs the Energy Democracy Initiative. He's widely known as the guru of distributed energy. He's received accolades for his vivid illustrations of the economic and environmental benefits of local ownership of decentralized renewable energy. Among other things, he hosts the Local Energy Rules podcast. And on that, he tells powerful stories of local clean energy action and frequently discusses the ownership and scale of the energy system on his Twitter. And again, check the chat for that information. John authored Energy Self-Reliant States, which is a state-by-state atlas of renewable energy potential that the New York Times highlighted. It shows that most states don't actually need to look outside their borders to meet their electricity needs. He's written extensively on the economic advantages of democratizing the electricity system and community renewable energy. He's published a rich interactive map on the solar grid parity and polished the policies, especially Minnesota's solar energy standard, which was necessary to support locally owned renewable energy development. And just before actually this call or this webinar started, Leslie Glustrom passed along some feedback from someone who hopefully is attending this evening, who wanted to be sure that your work, John, in Minnesota with Xcel and also the state, apparently this work, the value of solar study is highly regarded and was very instrumental in making Minnesota the US leader in community solar. So that's super cool. Anyway, let's, enough about all of that stuff. You can check out the website, check out his bio, check out the blog, follow him on Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. Again, thanks for being here, John Farrell.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's easy to make the travel all the way to Boulder these days on the internet. So no problem to join you, and always a pleasure to have a chance to be among those who I think have really been leaders on helping to set up good conversations about local control and the opportunities of energy democracy. So I decided to go right for it in terms of the title for my talk is Franchise a Failure, because I know that I have seen opinion pieces both ways about what has happened in Boulder with the franchise. And I know that people asked similar questions in Minneapolis when we were debating extension of our franchise with Xcel Energy, which happens to be our same utility company. So I wanted to start off though with sort of a fun little question that we can pop in the chat here, which is you can answer this about how it feels to you, or just go for the honest answer. But when Boulder citizens first voted to form a municipal utility, who was the US president? So just go ahead, you can put A, B, or C in the chat. Chat's that little bubble, should be at the bottom of your screen. Just throw an answer in there. I'm just kind of curious what people will say here. Cool. Well, thank you for participating in that. I see we have a variety of answers. Obviously, the true answer is Barack Obama, although I'm sure that it feels a little bit differently. The reason I brought this up and put Franklin Roosevelt on there was actually this quote. I'm just going to give folks a second to read it here. I'll read it aloud, actually. "The public power is a birch rod in the cupboard to be taken out and used only when the child gets beyond the point where a mere scolding does no good." And the reason I think this is an important point to bring up is just that it has been for decades the idea at the highest levels of our government that this idea of municipalization, of having public power as an option, is an important check on the power of private utility companies that have a monopoly or that are providing poor service for communities to have a way to approach that and to advance the public interest. And so I think this is really the core of the kind of question that is asked in many cities across the country as we face the needs of climate change, the desire to capture economic benefits, the desire to address energy burden and disproportionate impacts of fossil fuels. So I want to start off by just saying I think there's more than a municipal utility in making progress on the things that communities want. So to address that first question that I posed in the title of my talk about whether or not franchise is a failure, I think it's important to recognize that already things have been accomplished even before you get to this question of whether or not where you're at now is good or bad. So, the outcome that you have agreed to in the franchise agreement with Xcel Energy is for 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And that's pretty significant. And it's a relatively short time period, and Xcel is committed to working with Boulder to achieve this ambitious goal. So you have that in the books as something important that has been agreed to by the utility and by the community. You also have this opportunity for local input. As Leslie Glustrom could tell you, having to go to the Public Utilities Commission and participate there as an intervener is really laborious. You have to learn a lot of technical language. It's not a particularly accessible space for an ordinary citizen. So even in a franchise agreement and under this kind of partnership between a utility and a community, you change the way that the conversation can take place. It's something that we've celebrated in Minneapolis with our franchise agreement that, Xcel executives have to sit down with local officials on a regular basis and to talk about the mutual goals that the two entities have and to talk about how the utility is going to meet the goals of the community. And that by itself is a victory compared to the way that we normally get to have input with utilities, which is not very much. You can call their customer service line if you want, and it's probably not going to get passed out of that department. You can try to intervene at the Public Utilities Commission if you're a superhero like Leslie. Otherwise, it's pretty difficult to have a significant impact. So having a seat at the table there matters a lot. And I think it's also no coincidence that two communities, Minneapolis and Boulder, that have both exercised this conversation around local ownership, that have both taken the birch rod out of the cupboard, as it were, as Franklin Roosevelt would have said. Our members are served by the same investor-owned utility, Xcel Energy, that was the first among investor-owned utilities to pledge to deliver 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. And thanks in part to the fact that Colorado and New Mexico and Minnesota, which comprise most of the utility service territory, all have ambitious state renewable portfolio standards, Xcel Energy is actually more credibly along the way to that path than many other utilities that have made similar pledges. So it is not a coincidence that the efforts that you've made in Boulder organizing around the idea of more local control and demanding better from your utility have had an impact and beyond your borders. And that's also true in terms of the other campaigns for municipal utilities that we've seen. In the last 11 years, since Boulder really got serious about this and since Boulder passed its first municipalization ballot measure, 10 additional cities across the country have gone down that path to some degree as well, whether that's in Decorah, Iowa, having a vote, Santa Fe, New Mexico, doing a feasibility study of a municipal takeover, in San Francisco, studying municipalization, and then also exercising their power of community choice, and a number of other cities. So I think it's also important to just recognize and to the work that you all have put in Boulder has been noticed by others across the country, and we have held up Boulder as a model for how communities can exercise that right for more self-determination. And it has having an impact on those communities as well. So The work that you've done is not gone unnoticed. And I think the last thing it is important to recognize is that you've left your options open in this agreement as well. So most franchise agreements between utilities and cities extend at least 20, maybe 30 years. Chicago's was 30 years long. Minneapolis's was 20 years long. I've seen versions that were 50 years, some that automatically renewed without action by a city council. So to have set much shorter deadlines and off-ramps based on actual performance, I think is a really significant change in the relationship between a city and its utility. And Minneapolis also pursued that as well, having earlier off-ramps from the franchise contract if the city found that the partnership agreement wasn't working. So on the whole, I think it's important to recognize that where you're at, things have already been accomplished in terms of changes that have been made both for the city of Boulder, for Xcel Energy as a utility, nationally in terms of inspiring other folks. And hopefully you've set this up for success in terms of having some really concrete benchmarks and how the franchise contract might work. Another thing I think that's important to recognize is that it really, whether it's 100% clean energy pledge that a city might make or a municipalization movement, is that it also actually motivates the city itself to take bolder action around climate and clean energy. And we've seen that. There's 3 examples I'll just tick off here really quick that I followed in Boulder and found to be, I think, really great examples of how cities can lead. And I'll share some from other cities as well. So you have the smart regs that were adopted about a decade ago, requiring rental property owners to do energy audits and then to make improve those properties to reduce their emissions, to reduce the energy costs for the tenants. You have a community bulk discount program where there's been bulk purchases of electric vehicles, electric bikes, solar panels, ways that the city has worked to help residents and businesses in the community have access to cleaner technology at a better price. And then you have Boulder's climate tax, which is still really unique among cities across the country. There have now been other strategies that cities have followed to raise revenue to focus on climate and clean energy from an equitable perspective. But it was really Boulder that led the way in thinking about the idea of a local revenue source that could support the efforts around sustainability. And I want to hold these up because I think it's important to note that even though the city was in this process of trying to take over the utility, the city was also exercising authority over things over which it already had control. And that's, I think, a really important step for cities to take across the country. And so Boulder, again, has been providing an example. That example inspired this program in Minneapolis. It's called the Green Cost Share Program. The program offers partial matching grants for clean energy improvements to properties in the city. It also does lead abatements and some other things. It's a program run by the health department. You can see its funding and the number of projects funded grew dramatically in 2019 and 2020 after we were able to raise the franchise fee on the gas and electric utilities to increase funding. And the program is really well known as well for focusing on investment in the city's green zones, which are areas where there has been historically more people of color, low income folks, and folks with much higher energy burdens. And so it's been a really nice marriage of a focus on clean energy, on equity, and on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And a hat tip to the director of the program who keeps really good statistics on the projects that they fund, but they're projecting over $10 million in lifetime energy savings from the projects they funded so far, and a significant amount of energy savings as well. Again, exercising the power of the city to take action. Minneapolis also passed an ordinance inspired, I think, by things that Boulder and other cities have done that requires when a property is sold or rented to a new tenant that they get some information about the energy use of that property so that that new buyer or renter has an idea of like what their total cost to live in that property would be like, and also has an opportunity at that moment to ask for things like energy efficiency improvements, or to think about how they might finance that as part of the purchase of a home. And there's other exciting things happening as well at the city level. Ithaca, New York, many of you might have read this week, made a commitment to decarbonize all of its buildings by 2030, public and private. It's a pretty remarkable story of pulling together financing, a partnership with Block Power, which has done kind of a model in Brooklyn, New York of how you can decarbonize a lot of buildings. I'm actually interviewing the sustainability director from Ithaca next week for the Local Energy Rules podcast, which we'll post sometime later this fall. But I'm really excited to share the story of how cities might be able to even be more aggressive than setting regulations for private owners, but to actually come up with a strategy that can be executed in 10 years to try to do full decarbonization. It's really, really quite remarkable. And they're doing it without a significant source of public money, but rather raising money from the private sector. Just a couple other examples I want to offer. Milwaukee, Oregon is a suburb outside of Portland, has done a number of things as I talk about in the conversation I had with Mayor Mark Gamba for our podcast. Solarized campaigns like Boulder has done, advocating for stretch energy codes at the state legislature to give the city more flexibility. And they've also actually been able to do aggregation project with the local utility, or at least they're exploring that. It would allow them to do something similar to what Boulder is I think negotiating with Xcel, where they would be able to get 100% renewable electricity for all of the community members, for all the customers in the community through a bilateral negotiation, but where the city is negotiating on behalf of all the customers. This is formalized in policy in 9 different states called community choice energy or community choice aggregation. But not only is Milwaukee, but a number of cities in Utah have also been had the opportunity to do this. In Utah, all the communities that are shown on this map, which constitute about 1/3 of the state's population, are being able to participate in a project that allows a partnership with Rocky Mountain Power to get 100% net renewable electricity, which is particularly remarkable in a state like Utah that has a fairly conservative government. And as I understand it, Rocky Mountain Power can be the provider of that electricity, but it doesn't have to be the provider. So it's been an interesting way where we've seen other cities find a way to create a partnership with the utility, and hopefully to also reach similarly ambitious goals, that 100% clean energy goals also for 2030 for the communities in Utah. One last thing I just wanted to mention is the city of Minneapolis actually hired a full-time person to do intervention at the Public Utilities Commission or Public Service Commission, they go by different names, on behalf of the city. It's really changed things a lot. We do, for example, ILSR, my organization, does a fair amount of work at the Public Utilities Commission, and it's been interesting to see the way in which the comments and the intervention by the city have helped to change the conversation in front of the commission, because the city will bring up, hey, we have this partnership with Xcel Energy. Xcel Energy is committed to do this thing, and the promises that they're making about this activity in this docket, whether it's about electric vehicles or new power plants, don't align with what they've told us at the local level. And we found that the commission is receptive to that and has been willing to elevate those questions for the utility to have to respond to, and has been able to change some of the way that those conversations have happened. So I just want to emphasize, there are a lot of things that can happen even without a muni, and I think the franchise contract that Boulder has signed is a good indication of the things that can happen. I think it's inspired a lot of other remarkable work by cities, and also whether in Boulder or in other communities, shown what it is that you can do as a city alone, even as you were trying to take over a utility. I want to just spend a couple minutes here comparing the partnership agreements. So Minneapolis formed its clean energy partnership with its gas and electric utility in 2014. And Boulder obviously is having their partnership set up as part of this franchise agreement here very recently. So I just, again, want to note Minneapolis's partnership includes the electric and the gas utility, but the goals of the partnership are actually very similar. So you can see 80% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in common with both of the partnership agreements. In both communities have a strong commitment to local electricity generation. I think even though one is focused on a capacity number and the other one is a percentage, that they're actually fairly similar in terms of the share of electricity that would come from local sources. Obviously, I've already mentioned Boulder's 100% renewable electricity commitment. In Minneapolis, the current partnership work plan for the next couple of years is meant to focus as well on electrification of gas end uses, which has been fascinating to have the gas utility part of that conversation, and also on getting really deep energy efficiency retrofits with community benefits. And by that, we mean like being able to hire people out of the community and to help them get jobs in that in doing those energy efficiency retrofits. The partnership structures are also pretty similar, kind of an executive team or partnership board where members of the city and the utilities sit on those committees or on those boards together and generally meet quarterly. I do want to note, and I think this is actually important, that the Xcel Colorado president is actually on the executive team in the partnership in Boulder, whereas in Minneapolis, we have some lower level folks in the utility. It makes a difference when the person who's there actually has the power to make changes. for the utility, and doesn't have to kind of come back and say, well, I talked to my higher ups and they're not going to go for it. So I hope that the president is actually present in those meetings and not just sending a delegate, because I think that actually is a significant difference. The other components of the partnership are very similar. There's a planning team in Minneapolis that consists of city council staff and utility staff, similar to the project oversight team here in Boulder. And then both partnerships feature a community advisory board or panel that helps to provide advice. And I do have to say, Minneapolis is, might have something to do with me being on it and being a professional in the energy sector, along with some of the other members, but we really have been able to push, in particular, the city to do some things that have been very supportive and to ask really tough questions of the utility as part of that advisory board. It was actually from the advisory board that we were able to propose the franchise fee increase that the city ultimately adopted, and that the utilities were willing to sit on the sideline for that discussion. So I think there is a big opportunity there to look to in terms of the partnership. Before I go any further, I've got some kind of bigger picture stuff I'd like to talk about. I do want to just be really candid as well, though, that with the partnership, a lot of the things that we want to do or want to see happen, like transforming the way that energy efficiency services are delivered to low-income folks to make sure that the opportunity is there for everybody who pays into programs that provide rebates, but can't front the money for an energy efficient appliance, can't borrow the money to do an energy efficiency retrofit. It's really slow going. Trying to get the utility to change the way they do their business model is really complex. They are held back by the fact that the market structure is a certain way and the city is not able to change their financial incentives. You can go to the commission with them and you can ask for that, but the utility might not ask very hard, especially if they're happy with the way things are going right now. Utilities are sometimes not very helpful if they don't want to be. We've been trying on this financing thing for 3 or 4 years now to do a tariff-based on-bill financing program, also called inclusive financing. You can look on our website. We've got a report and also a short video that kind of explain it. With the gas company, we finally got to yes after 3 or 4 years of negotiation, and Xcel Energy has basically just stonewalled us and said, nope, we're not going to do it. And there is nothing we can do to compel them to do it. So at the same time, I think this partnership is a unique opportunity, and I want to point out that it matters more than having nothing. It doesn't give you the same powers that having your own utility would, where you actually get to make the decisions and you get to decide what it is that's important and what trade-offs you want to make in terms of costs and benefits. Whereas right now you have both a utility commission and a market structure that are going to inhibit the interest of the utility in participating in the things you want to do. So happy to answer more questions about that, but I do want to be both candid about the fact that I think there are big opportunities here, but also from our experience, it is a struggle sometimes to get the things that you want. I just wanted to spend like 30 seconds. The introduction talks a little bit about my role with an ILSR in my energy program. I just want to say that broadly, we have programs across a lot of economic sectors focused on building local power to fight corporate control of the economy. We work in broadband, in waste. I see one of your upcoming events is on a zero waste economy. And we have a waste to wealth program that works on economic development-based recycling and community composting. And we also work on supporting local and independent businesses. And as was mentioned at the outset, I'm on Twitter and a host of the Local Energy Rules podcast, where you can get a lot more information about the work that I do and the work of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. So I'm going to pause really quick here. I like to give a little bit of an overview about why we have monopoly utilities as kind of some groundwork for how this issue of public power versus private power and some of the like broader issues about a market structure and energy democracy should be dealt with. I'm curious if folks want me to talk about that, which I can usually do in about 5 to 10 minutes, or folks feel pretty well grounded in like, yeah, we understand about about monopoly utilities, market structure. Let's skip that and get into the meat of the conversation. So give me just a second. I have to actually unfull screen it so I can see the responses here. All right, a lot of yeses. Leslie, you know everything about this already. What do you need me to say it? That's funny. Okay, I will do it and I will try to keep it quick. But thank you for participating in the choose your own adventure version. Having talked a lot specifically about Boulder, I want to kind of take a step back and talk about this partnership and the municipalization campaign in the context of sort of the larger issue around the electricity system and the market structure that we have. So 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, when we were first stringing wires to provide electric power, it really was a Wild West. It was a new and unregulated industry. Lots of little light companies were springing up, raising capital, building power plants in order to supply electricity to customers. And so one of the early titans of the industry, Samuel Insull, he was the sort of the right-hand man to Thomas Edison, recognized that there was an opportunity here, that because of the lack of regulation and the craziness, because of the fact that electricity is, in a way, as they call it, a natural monopoly, in the sense that you don't really need more than one set of wires running from a utility to a home, that they could seek out regulation, and it would be a way to both preserve and protect their profits. It would protect them, as he said, from competition, and it may also provide better service and more affordable electricity access for more people. And public officials bought that. And we started to see the creation of public utility commissions in the early 1900s to oversee the new monopoly market structure that states were adopting, giving utilities an area of a territory in which they would face no competition in order that they could raise the money to build the power plants to expand access to affordable power. And the key to it, of course, and I just love this sign, which is a parking sign, of course, from a retail business, but also could really be used to describe what it's like to be a customer of a monopoly utility, which is you have to be a customer at all times. That is the key premise, that you are captive. And through that captivity, the utility knows that it can recover the costs from the investments it makes in the grid system. And I have to say, for the early decades of this system and this structure, it was very successful. All the way up until the 1970s, utilities found ways to capture economies of scale, build larger power plants, and as they did so, the actual cost, the real cost of electricity actually fell, such that rate cases that utilities would file would actually be lowering rates and encouraging even greater use of electricity, which drove a lot of economic development across the country as we were able to use this more and more affordable resource to power all sorts of things beyond electric lighting. The asterisk I have in the top left here, of course, gets into what I call the structural gap, though, that has emerged between, over the past few decades, between the market structure we set up with a monopoly utility, with this idea of kind of universal affordable service, and a whole host of other public goods that aren't really covered by that initial regulation, such as air quality and climate change. And of course, the disproportionate impact that these have had on people of color, who tend to be the ones that live near the power plants and experience the worst of the health impacts and of the impacts from climate change. So yes, we made progress on expanding electricity, but we failed to effectively incorporate these environmental and health costs into the energy system. And the monopoly utilities, having not being held accountable to them, felt no need to be responsive to them. We also see sort of a structural gap emerging in the kind of electricity that we're asking for. So this is a product that we release every year that looks at new power plant capacity in the United States. You can see one of the big changes is that we have a lot less fossil fuel power plants being added to the grid, represented in the purple and the black. But the most exciting part is the orange bar on the top, which represents small solar on rooftops of homes and businesses. Then now about 1 in 7 new megawatts that's added to the grid every year comes from these small scale resources. So we increasingly have customers providing their own power, something that wasn't really foreseen in the way that we wrote the rules for the monopoly utilities. And you can see that in sort of a mismatch then in the way the grid even operates. So it's not even just a question of like who makes the money and who produces the power, but the transmission system and the grid system, as you can see in the map in the lower left here, was set up in sort of a hub and spoke structure. Build a big power plant, send the power to customers in a one-way direction. And on the other hand, we have lots of customers now, or cities choosing to build their own power production and wanting to do that more and more for a whole host of reasons. There's also a mismatch too in the amount of profit that utilities get. So this is a fascinating chart from the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley that compares other low risk investments to the rate of return that you make if you're an investor in a monopoly utility company. And what we find over the last 30 to 40 years is that other low risk investments have had their return decrease as inflation has gone down and the economy stabilized after the energy crisis. Investor-owned utilities see almost the same profits today that they did 30 and 40 years ago, that there's been an increasing gap there, that even though they make low risk investments, after all, remember that sign, you must be a customer at all times. their profits have remained high. And that's why Abraham Lincoln famously said, monopolies don't innovate. And that is part of the problem, is that there's also one of the structural gaps is that utilities don't have an entrepreneurial culture. Having a monopoly means that you don't really have to think about how do you bring in new ideas, new ways of being, incorporate new technologies. Actually, Abraham Lincoln didn't say that, but he should have said it because it's very true, especially of the utility sector. So I want to pivot here, and having done the history, talk a little about this moment sort of structural choice that we have. And this is where I often incorporate the term energy democracy as sort of the alternative to the energy monopoly system that we have now. So you saw this map on the left before of the transmission system. And I just want to compare it very quickly to another network that we have, which is the interstate highway system. So both of them were built out over a fairly significant period of time. Electric grid a little bit more slowly than the interstate highway system. One is owned by private companies, but meant to serve a public need. And the other is publicly owned and meant to serve a public need. And the difference comes in how we allow people to use it. That the interstate highway system and our road network in general is open access. So to use package delivery as an example, all of these companies can deliver packages on that highway and road system for the same exact price. There's no discrimination against them. They all have to pay the same taxes or the same tolls or what have you in order to use the roads. They pay the same registration fees. There's no difference. Whereas the electric grid is operated in a very discriminatory way, which is to say it's owned by a utility that has its own financial interest that is separate from the other competitors in the field. And they control all the gateways to that system. And so we really are at a moment where we need more choices. And this is where I think municipalization is an important piece of context for this broader structural issue that we have. So some folks rightly say that the problem is that the platform, the transmission system, the distribution system of the electric grid needs to be open access. It needs to be treated in the same way that our road system is. And one way to do that is to make it public, is to say, let's take over that system from the private operator who has all sorts of incentives not to operate it in the public interest, and make it public, where we can enforce rules for the system that would allow for the defense of the public interest. And there's just a few examples I want to give of the kinds of things that can happen if we have a system that's open to that. So I did an interview recently with the CEO of Ohm Connect. It's a company that aggregates residential power demand. And so they have like smart thermostats and solar arrays and battery storage in hundreds and thousands of homes. And they network these together so that they can bid in and participate in electricity markets. And they can only do this in like 2 or 3 states, Texas, California, and I think there's maybe one other state. Because in most states, utilities have successfully prevented policy from being adopted that would allow them to do this. And yet what this network of customers can do is provide as much as 500 megawatts of networked power that can respond to market needs without having to spend a single dollar of utility money in order to build it, which of course utilities aren't terribly interested in. And that 500 megawatts, just to give you some context, is more than half of the summer peak demand for the city of Minneapolis. And it's just a whole bunch of customers together that have been aggregated by a private company. But they can't get market access with the way that we've designed the grid system. We talked a little bit, or it was mentioned about Minnesota's community solar program in the introduction. There are over 14,000 subscribers now to 800 megawatts of solar that's being produced from these community solar projects owned by independent developers and subscribed to by ordinary customers, both homes and businesses. And I did an interview with the general manager of Cooperative Energy Futures to talk to him about this program and why it's so unique and important. But Minnesota is one of the few states that have a community solar law that allows for unlimited development. Most other states that have community solar, and it's still only a minority of states, have restrictions on how much power can come from community solar every year, which restricts its growth. And Colorado is unfortunately one of those states. It was one of the first states to have community solar, but it's been surpassed by a few other states now in the amount of capacity because of that limitation. And the last example I want to offer is the Pine Tree Power Company. So in Maine, where they have a couple of companies that own a lot of the transmission system up there and are among the worst rated utilities in terms of customer service and reliability and cost, there's been an effort at the legislature. In fact, the legislature there passed a bill that was unfortunately vetoed by the governor to have a public takeover of the system with what they would call the Pine Tree Power Company. But what's important about it is it wouldn't just be a public takeover, it would also open access on that grid system. So there could be a networking of all of these different resources together by private parties to serve the needs of the grid system without it all being controlled by one utility company, public or private. That's going to be going on the ballot. And there's actually a former member of Clean Energy Action in Boulder who is working on that effort. I was just talking to her earlier today. And so if you want, you can also listen to a podcast interview I did with Representative Seth Berry, who was one of the sponsors of the legislation. And he talks about the importance of this model in helping to address the modern needs of our grid system and how it can be responsive to things like climate and energy equity. So ILSR works broadly in our energy program. We try to give people a sense of vision about how the economy should work. We provide tools to communities. We like to work on changing the rules of the system so that the market and the structures and the rules work for the things that we want to see happen, like 100% renewable energy, local economy. We have some other resources on our website, our community power map, where we show how states can pass policies that give cities more power. Our toolkit, which gives stories of what cities have been able to accomplish, and it probably features at least a couple from Boulder, and also the Local Energy Rules podcast, which I would encourage you to check out. I have over 120 stories and episodes where we've talked with city leaders about the efforts that they've made around climate and energy, with a lot of the cities that have done some of the innovative things like Boulder, as I talked about during the conversation. So I'm going to stop there and would be more than happy to join in some conversation. I'll start by looking at the Q&A here and then see where we go. One of the questions here is, are there successes countering the lobbying spending of utilities and fossil fuel corporations? Yes, in fact, there's a really good example. If you Google Clean Virginia, a group of activists out there developed a no utility money pledge, which they asked of candidates I think it was started in 2017 maybe, or 2019 the state elections for the assembly there. Something like 40 or 50 candidates signed the pledge, including a dozen or so that actually won election to the House of Delegates. And it dramatically changed the conversation in the state house there, especially with regards to Dominion Energy, which had been for a long time kind of had the state capitol there in an iron fist. So I think the best thing to do is to start highlighting the problems with the way that utilities spend our money. So I'm very interested in this kind of question, because the point to me is one of, and you can approach this from a progressive or from a conservative perspective. From a progressive perspective, one should ask yourself, why should utilities that have no competitors, and so I don't get to choose who I have utility, why should they be out there being able to spend money lobbying my legislators? At a minimum, I should ask my legislator not to take their money, because they make decisions that affect the profitability of this company. They regulate them effectively. But why should they even be able to lobby at all might be another question. The other one is just that we've had the Supreme Court say that it is a form of forced speech to be in a union that does political spending. And especially if you're in a situation where you have to be part of a union, as has been the case in the public sector. Well, the same argument can be made here. I have no choice but to be a customer of Xcel Energy for my electricity. They are compelling my speech when they spend their money to lobby against things that I want, and they should not be allowed to do it. So I think there's a couple of different ways there that we can make that point. But also, I think that a utility no money pledge for legislators is a really powerful way to help legislators think carefully about that connection between, I make decisions that affect the profitability of this company, and I should not be taking money from them as candidate. Another good question here about utility scale and local and community solar gardens. I feel like I've been fighting a rearguard effort on this one forever. I have written a piece, and I'm trying to remember the name of it now so that I can share it with everyone. I think it was something like the farce in the comparison between utility scale and rooftop solar. The problem is that we are often going to hear utilities say, if you do community solar, if you do rooftop solar, it costs so much more than utility scale stuff. I remember, it's called the farce of free delivery. And that's exactly what it is. So when the utility quotes a price for solar that they buy, they're quoting it, produced at a massive solar array out in the middle of a desert, nowhere near where anybody uses electricity. When we talk about community solar or rooftop solar, it's obviously right where we're using electricity. It's producing it on those local power lines that are right in our community, or even right on our home, where the electricity flows then right into the house. So there's no delivery cost to that. Utilities like to gloss over that. Public regulators have swallowed that for a remarkable number of years because they just keep hearing it all the time from all the lobbyists that the utilities have. So I think the key that we need to talk about is, like, if you ordered something from Amazon and Amazon said you have to go pick it up at the distribution center in Chicago, we would all recognize that that was not a good deal. But for some reason, when the utility says we can get solar for 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and they don't even bother to tell you how they're going to get it to your house, we all seem to just shrug at that. So I think that's, in my mind, the key question to pose to regulators and to utilities is, how much does it cost to deliver that electricity? So what is the actual comparison dollar for dollar? The second thing, though, is that we're actually, once we're in that debate, we've already been forced onto the utilities battlefield of talking about the cost. The point is that local and community solar gardens serve a very different purpose. They are meant to allow people to reduce their energy bills, to lower energy burdens for people who might be renters who don't have access to solar on their own rooftop. They're a source of economic development for a community, to create jobs, potentially to create a workforce pipeline to help people who have been underemployed. They serve all sorts of purposes. And therefore, we should be willing to pay whatever it is that we think it's worthwhile to do when we invest in that kind of solar. That's very, very different from when we talk about just investing in a commodity resource like utility scale solar or wind. I'm a huge fan of those things. We should build lots of that stuff, but we shouldn't pretend that it's the same kind of stuff that we're getting from rooftops or that we're getting from community solar gardens. Let's see. What is another good question here? Do you see a future for incentives like the feed-in tariff in the United States? If you want to go back on ILSR's website, way back, like in 2010, I did write about feed-in tariffs. I like them a lot. The value of solar price or policy that I worked on very hard in Minnesota is actually modeled on a feed-in tariff. The idea was we would say, here's the amount that solar is worth to the grid that the utility must pay, and then here's the incentive that we'll stack on top of that to encourage solar development. We got one of two. We got the value of solar. There's just not a lot of appetite for a feed-in tariff. People can't seem to wrap their head around the idea that even though we will pay through like a federal tax credit to get people to do solar, they really can't wrap their hand around the idea that we would incorporate that into the price that we're willing to pay for something if it seems like it's higher than the price of something else. So Americans don't seem very well suited to feed-in tariffs. We do have some coverage on our community power map of some places where they still have feed-in tariff-like structures. Folks can read about them on our website. If you Google feed-in tariff and ILSR, you will find things that I have written that explain what a feed-in tariff is, but unfortunately, I don't think it's a policy opportunity that we're going to see a lot of. Let's see here. Different kinds of 100% renewable electricity, 24/7 net renewables, renewable electricity credits. Yeah, I actually just did a podcast that we published with folks in Des Moines, Iowa, who adopted 100% renewable electricity goal for the city. And we did dive into this issue about net renewable versus 24/7 renewable. So the idea here, of course, is, and I think actually it was, can't think of the young woman's name now, the famous woman, the climate organizer, but she was asked about this idea of net zero. And she said, I'm going to do net zero swear words. So for every swear word that I say, I'm going to say something polite. And that's the idea behind net zero, which is you can still do polluting resources. You're just going to, quote, offset them by producing more renewable energy on the other side of things. So a net renewable energy goal might allow you to, for example, produce enough renewable electricity on an annual basis that the city would consume, plus a little bit extra for the times when that renewable energy wasn't being produced, and instead some fossil fuel energy was slotting into that. There's a great conversation in that podcast about it. And I should say, for people who don't like listening to podcasts, we do a summary of the podcast as well. You can find on our website, but it's the one with the city council member from Des Moines, Iowa, and 1,000 Friends of Iowa, where we really dive into that particular conversation. James has a question about conflict of interest rules for mayor and city attorney and city council members. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I know there are some ethics rules about political campaigning that were flagrantly violated in our most recent municipal election, but I actually don't know about conflict of interest rules. So I'm sorry that I can't answer that question in more detail. There's a couple questions about joining an RTO, a regional transmission organization, and whether or not Colorado should work on creating one. I'm not an expert in this kind of thing. I guess what I would say is I have for many years seen a conflict between the development of transmission and the development of distributed energy, in part because our planning system was always set up to kind of segregate the two. So a utility would propose a transmission line, and in that planning process, there was really not much consideration of whether or not we could accomplish the goals of that transmission line development by doing local energy or energy efficiency or conservation or a number of other things. That being said, I'm a huge fan of the studies from Vibrant Clean Energy. They've been shared by a group called Local Solar for All. They did a national study. There have been a number of state-based studies as well. And what they talk about, I think is really important, is this notion of co-optimization. So the breakthrough piece is most people who've been thinking about the power sector have ignored local renewable energy resources almost entirely and just looked at, to get to our climate goals, our clean energy goals, how do we do that? And how much big stuff do we have to build and how much more transmission do we need to get there? And the models from Vibrant Clean Energy do a nice job of saying, actually, what happens if we build a lot of that stuff at the local level? And does it get us to lower cost? And the answer was, yes, it does. So what's also true in those studies that they say transmission expansion may also be an important piece of that in order to getting to the lowest cost way that we have a low carbon grid. But it's in the context of maximizing those local resources. So as much as like 25% of your renewable energy production is coming from local resources. And then it can save a huge amount of money. I think the national number was like $500 billion in savings in getting to a low carbon grid. So that's to say that if we're going to do that and we're going to need to build additional transmission, I think that kind of regional organization can be helpful. Some of the role that it plays in terms of like making sure that the least cost energy is being dispatched. At the same time, they can be gamed just like any other kind of market structure. I recommended reading about Entergy in Louisiana, for example. They on purpose joined the Midwest RTO instead of the Southwest Power Pool because there was fewer connections, which allowed them to both participate in the market ostensibly, but still to largely monopolize the development of transmission within their network. There are also a number of states that have what are called right of first refusal laws, so that even when their utilities participate in those regional networks, they still get a monopoly essentially on transmission expansion. So I don't think an RTO by itself necessarily solves a lot of problems, but if structured the right way with the right rules in combination with other good rules for giving choice and competition, I think it can be important. Let's see here. Good question here about the Edison Electric Institute and trade organizations. I just want to elevate here at work by the Energy and Policy Institute. Google them, they do amazing work uncovering utility shenanigans. They and others have been working to prevent utilities from getting reimbursement from their captive customers for their trade organization memberships, which includes lobbying to kill rooftop solar, to support more methane gas power plants, et cetera. So ILSR has not worked directly on that issue, but we are aware of the fact that utilities used to disclose how much they spent as part of that, and they used to participate in an audit that the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, NARUC, would audit utilities and find out like how much money they spent on that, and then state commissions would use that to decide whether or not they wanted to allow utilities to recover those costs. It's a big issue because utilities at this point, as they say, presumptively recover those costs. And the goal is to change it to say utilities should have to fight to get those costs recovered and prove that the money that was spent in that trade group was actually worth it for their customers. Because in general, it isn't well spent. Oh, here we go. Another transmission question from Leslie. I'll take a shot at this one. Yeah, so, well, this gets right at the heart of what I was talking about earlier about my longtime skepticism of transmission compared to distributed resources. So I think the key here, and that Leslie is getting at, and this is really the problem that you face as a city trying to work with the investor-owned utility, as a clean energy advocate trying to solve these problems, is that I'm bad at this analogy. The one about like if you have a nail, everything looks like a hammer. If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I can't remember exactly what it is. Utilities, generally speaking, even as we have piled on requirements like renewable energy and energy efficiency, still generally make their money when they build stuff, power lines, power plants, what have you. So they're always going to be biased towards solving a problem in a way that involves them spending capital and getting that return on investment. You know, in that chart I showed you earlier about how their return on investment has largely not changed over 40 years. They don't want it to change. They've got a lot of lobbyists trying to make sure that it doesn't change, and they want to build a lot of stuff. And frankly, Xcel Energy is probably one of the cleverest utilities in figuring out how to say, we'll give you the clean energy that you want. We're just happy to own all of it when we do that. And we're going to do that in a way that maybe isn't the cheapest way we could have gotten there. They actually just did a competitive bid for a giant new solar project in Minnesota that will replace a coal plant. There were 3 bids, 2 of which Xcel Energy dismissed. So they're in charge of the bidding process, I should mention. And 2 of the 2 competitive bids were dismissed before they even got to the price comparison for, you know, reasons that Xcel explained that, you know, they wouldn't qualify for one reason or another. And so conveniently, Xcel picked their own bid to build this utility scale solar array. And it's just one of those examples of when the utility has so much power over so many steps in the process, it's hard to be able to take them at face value when they tell you this thing we want to build is actually the best deal for you, when you know, in fact, that it's the best deal for them. So I think as much as we know that the clean energy goals that we want to achieve writ large as a country may in fact be easier to get to if we see capital expenditures on big things like transmission, I'm always going to be skeptical when a utility puts it out because it aligns too well with the way that they make money. Let's see here, some other good questions. Will grid infrastructure spending fund our two-way smart grid? I think there is money, especially in like the Build Back Better bill at the federal level, that could be spent on a smart grid. The question, of course, is whether or not it will be operated like a smart grid. So I think Boulder famously had a smart grid city project with Xcel Energy that, as I recall, went so over budget that the utility actually was disallowed some cost recovery. And there's also a persistent problem when even when a utility puts in a smart meter and all of a sudden has all sorts of data that can help it do good things, it doesn't share it with anybody. It calls it proprietary and keeps customers and third parties from having access to that data. So a smart grid is really only going to be smart so long as the rules make sure that there's open access to that data. And it's really not about how we spend the dollars from an infrastructure perspective that matters. Like, we can spend the same $100 million on a smart grid that is just going to reinforce the utilities monopoly, or that is going to enable all sorts of cool things like the Ohm Connect virtual power plant. And it really is all about, do we write into the rules the open access that will allow for the utility to lose market share if it can't compete? And the problem is that the utilities are not used to having to compete, so they don't like that change. That's the kind of thing that we have to fight for. And frankly, that's the thing that you have to fight for, whether you're on a franchise contract or whether you were litigating against Xcel over the cost of their distribution system. You are fighting them over the same thing you will always be fighting them over, which is how much market share can they retain and how much profit can they keep for their shareholders. So always have that in mind. Anytime you're talking to them, whatever answer that you get, if you're thinking in your head, what is in it for their shareholders, you will be able to better understand what it is that they're talking about. Dave, I think I kind of answered your question already about rooftop PV and utility scale and community garden projects. Feel free to pose it again, maybe, if you feel like I didn't answer it, but the farce of free delivery. is the piece that I wrote on that, and I think kind of covers that pretty well. I would love to see folks spread it around because I think we really have to take a different run at that conversation. An email list connecting folks around the country, working on energy, democracy, and community power. Yes, I should do something like that, Leslie. It's long overdue, and hopefully I can get to that. It looks like I have one question left. I'm happy to take it really quick here, but I don't want to interrupt if you need to wrap up.
John, by all means, if you can stay, we'd love to have you continue on. And then I have a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Let me take this last one that's in the Q&A here real quick. Does it help centralization of the urban focus over rural energy sourcing if rural were to pay their own way? I'm not sure I actually understand that question well enough to answer it. I'm sorry. So why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Okay. Well, just given that one of our action items is we're asking everybody on this call to obviously sign up for Empower Hours in the future by getting on the Empower Our Future mailing list. But we're hoping folks will testify at the PUC in December 2nd. A lot of what you've been talking about is how we really have this ongoing battle with the utilities. Do you feel like there's room, or do you have any thoughts on how we can impact the PUC, since ultimately it seems like that's a lot of the problem as well?
I mean, I professionally spend time trying to convince the PUC of things here in Minnesota, with sometimes feeling like I'm successful and sometimes feeling like I'm running into a brick wall over and over again. So I wish I could give you good advice about like, say this thing and it will totally work, because it really does depend on the commissioners. It depends on how they like to interpret state laws around things. It depends on what kind of workload they have on their plates already. So you might have a really awesome case to make about why they should really dive into, should the utility be able to charge customers this money? And they may say to themselves, we've already got 6 rate cases open. We already have these 3 other big dockets that we're trying to deal with. The amount of money is so small, we're going to punt. So they are just people. So I do spend a lot of time in my comments trying to bring up and surface and highlight the utility's conflict of interest in any of the dockets that we're talking about. So always, I think it's just really important. And frankly, if you look at how successful conservatives are about capturing the dialogue around any policy issue in this country, repetition over and over again never hurts. If everybody in every comment they make before the commission takes 10 seconds to talk about, gee, in this issue of talking about transmission or a smart grid, it seems like the utility has a really big incentive to want to do this thing in this particular way. Let's acknowledge that without saying that they're wrong for wanting to do that, right? Like, these are the rules we wrote for them. If I'm a CEO of that company, I should absolutely be trying to maximize profits for my shareholders. But just pointing out, like, the structural incentive for them is to do it in a particular way. But the role of the Public Utilities Commission is to figure out what's best for customers, not what's best for the utility. So I think always helping to remind them of that charge that they have, that it's different from the utility's focus to focus on their shareholders, and that it's their job to do some interpreting of like, okay, the utility is giving us this option. What would it mean if we looked at these alternatives that are not as attractive to their shareholders? I think that's really important. I also sign off all of my comments in Minnesota by thanking the commission for having the opportunity to discuss something and that it hasn't been preempted by the legislature, because Xcel is known to go to the legislature in Minnesota and get a bill to end around the commission, to basically get away from having the commission review something that they ought to have to review. So they did that once for a gas plant that they wanted to build, and they were trying it for something else too, which I can't remember right now. But so it's my way of like thumbing my nose at them, because I know Xcel knows what I'm saying when I say that. I know the staff at the commission knows it. I know a few of the commissioners understand it as well. But just to highlight, like, if Xcel doesn't like what it gets at the commission, it tries a different way. I think that shows a little bit to the commission the lack of respect that Xcel has for being a regulated utility, that they're willing to go a different route in order to get what they want. So I think those kinds of things as context for what the conversation is about. I think you need people like Leslie who can contest on the very legal and specific technical issues as well, but always reminding the commission of its purpose and the way that the utility has its incentives stacked is really important.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to take that as an answer that would encourage everyone to go ahead and do that testimony to the PUC. And I just made it possible for Leslie to join us if she's willing or able. She may or may not, but just given we've spoken about her throughout this event. Hi, Leslie, I hear you.
Hey, Mary, thank you. And thanks to everybody who's on. We don't get to actually see who's on except for through the questions. And I see a lot of old friends, people who've been working on these issues for a long time from all over the country. And John, I just want to thank you so much for an excellent presentation and for kind of re-energizing us. We're chugging away here. Julie Zahnizer and Ramesh Bhatt and a few others are on our advisory panel. They met last night. And it's just really helpful. And I do look forward to combining, the folks in Minnesota with the folks in Colorado, with the folks in Maine and Des Moines and all these other places. You kind of know them all. And I think we've all been kind of coming to the same conclusion that the way I look at it is a monopoly is not likely to bring us optimal solutions as we go through this transition. We have Xcel moving in the right direction in Colorado, and I'm really grateful. I'm grateful for the role that Minneapolis played in helping to move them, the role that Denver played in helping to move them. But what I would say is that their pace is too slow and their price is way too high. And that's just, if we can't get a better system, and that's really what you've been talking about. You talk to people all over the country. I want to thank you so much for bringing us some of those stories directly here tonight. This is, it was tough. The election last year in the middle of the pandemic was a miserable, tough thing. So thank you so much for helping to kind of re-energize us. Really look forward to strengthening those lines of communication so that you can know what's going on here in Colorado. We can know what's going on in Minnesota. The folks in Maine and California and Utah and everybody else can get connected. This, I think, is the fundamental question facing our country. Do we want to use a 20th century structure to solve 21st century problems? You might be able to guess how I feel about the answer to that question. So thanks again, John. And again, I really want to thank everybody who's tuned in. I see some of your questions. We've got people from all over the state and some from outside of the state, John. And, your reputation, is widespread. And again, thank you so much for being here tonight, John, and best to your family.
I also want to just add, Leslie, I think you put it so well about whether a monopoly is the right way to go. And I think something to keep in mind is that for people like me who've spent a lot of time working in the energy sector, we sort of accept that monopoly is the way of doing business. Something to remember, like when you go to talk to people out in the community, most people don't even necessarily know that it is a monopoly or that we gave them a monopoly through public policy, that monopoly is not earned in the way that like Facebook or Amazon have it, if earned is the right term, but that we granted it to them with laws that gave them captive customers. And then it's really not something we do for just about anything in the United States, right? Like we're all about free markets here. So I think it's worth pointing out to people that it's sort of silly the way that we structure things. I had a great interview that I did with Chris Villarreal. He does a lot of like commission related work in Minnesota. He's a registered Republican. It was a great conversation because he and I talked about this, about markets versus monopolies. And he said, what I want is a well-regulated market. I want to see lots of competitors coming into this space. I think utility does a bad job, but I also just don't want it to be like laissez-faire, the strongest wins either. We need to structure this market in a sensible way. So I think most people would go for that.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that also, John, here in Colorado, where the Republicans really do not like, the monopoly concept. And certainly, the libertarians and the John Calderas, who's kind of a famous libertarian here in Colorado. And so I really think we can bring the two ends of that political spectrum around, maybe having different motivations, But still, I think this fundamental question of whether the 20th century monopoly model is the right model for the 21st century. That's why I think getting us all a little bit, you've done such a magnificent job with your podcasts. I highly recommend them. They're all amazing. But I think if we could have a more direct line of communication, because I think this issue has now matured enough. We have not quite critical mass in this country of people who are all kind of scratching their head and going, well, this monopoly thing just isn't working for fill in the community or fill in the state. And I think we want to get connected. We did this on the coal issue back almost 20 years ago. People are like, wait, why are we building another generation of coal plants? And as many people know, over 150 coal plants proposed during President George W. Bush's timeframe, over 150 stopped. Sadly, we didn't stop the one in Colorado. We're still messing around with that. But that was all done with a little stupid little email list that we're not supposed to talk about, but the fighting is mostly over now. So I think it's exciting to think about pulling us all together to think about a new structure for the 21st century.
Yeah. I'll get on that, Leslie. I'll be in touch. You and I should talk a little bit more
I
about how
appreciate
we
it,
do that.
John. I know you're already working super hard. Please keep us posted. Just feel free to send it to me or Mary or Chris or whoever, Julie, because what you're doing in Minneapolis and what our team is trying to do in Boulder, what the folks in Denver are doing, we've got really strong folks in Denver, passed a big tax, generates 40 million a year. I'm working in round numbers here to do climate work in Denver. And once again, they're kind of running into, what I call the mother may I game. You ask Monopoly, can we do this? And they're like, well, we'll get back to you, in 10 years. And the answer will be no. But we've got a lot of good folks working, and I think it's going to be really fun to exchange our information, both the good things and then, the sad things like Xcel, just getting rid of those 2 solar bids. I mean, good heavens.
So just on behalf of Empower Our Future, I'd like to thank you, John. Again, we do call this an Empower Hour, and we are at time. And we really, once again, really appreciate what you've said and your willingness to speak to us and your enthusiasm and all your work on this area. And just a quick reminder, you're seeing on the screen now just the save the date for the upcoming Empower Hour on December 9th. And role of zero waste as a climate solution. And also you'll see the encouragement to get on the Empower Our Future website and learn how to speak at the Public Utilities Commission. So thanks again. And on behalf of Empower Our Future, good night.
Thanks,
so much.
John.
Yeah, take care. Good luck.
Appreciate you so much. Thank you.